the ritual and stuff?
It was a lot more in depth than I seen before. And then like the opening invocation you did, I recognized the Old Norse for like hammer in the northeast, southwest, but what you said after that, I always heard hammer Oak Hindra Ali Vesta. God, I'm drawing a blank on it, but the words you used were different than what I've heard before.
Right. Yeah, right. So the incantation has to do what you just said with expelling ill forces from the area. And what I said was hold and hallow this sacred steed or holt.
Okay. And
So,
then
I mean, I've already expelled forces out of there previously, so I'm only asking them to continue to hold that sacred spot.
because that's like your dedicated ritual space, so you don't have to expel things every time.
Correct, correct. So for the
Okay.
people that are going to listen to this, we had a series of bloats for the Midwinter Wiesler Festival yesterday. And this was Anthony's first time actually ever attending a bloat of this sort. So as a first-time experiencer of that bloat, what are key things that you felt were important or didn't understand about it?
Well, I guess like the first thing that comes to mind as far as like being important is it was the first one I ever went to where the thought didn't hit, oh, they're noticing, it was they're here. Like I literally like felt something pull on me once the gods were invoked, and I started getting like itchy all over. I started like I couldn't just stand in one spot. Like that was kind of intense for me. Um which was super cool, like not a bad thing at all, but that was the first thing is like to me that was important is like they were there. They weren't just noticing, they weren't just giving a nod. Like I really felt like they were there. And
Yeah.
the only other thing that really stood out that I hadn't seen before, and I don't understand in Old Norse to make out the incantations you were saying was when you were uh uh pouring some of the offerings into the ground at the four cardinal points around the fire during the bloat. I'd never seen that before.
So there's a passage in Sigdrifamal where essentially the lore itself explains to you how to do the rituals. You just have to piece it together. And in Sigdrifamal, there's a portion where it's like Irometh asum that you give some to the Asir or the Asa, and then Tirometh alfum, you give some to the Alfs,
Okay.
and then the Sumar med visum vonum, and then that's to the Wanes and Whites, and
Okay.
then Sumar Hafa min Skirmin, and then that's to those wise men before us.
Okay. And if I'm remembering correctly, the Waynes are the Vanir?
I see it as a mix of the veneer and like good whites, good spirits that
Okay.
exist. So
Okay.
I know everybody's just tuning in. Welcome to another episode of The Sacred Stew. I'm your host, James, and this is my co-host, Anthony. And we have a information-packed session for you guys tonight on tonight's podcast. And Anthony, last week, can you give us a recap of what we talked about?
In a nutshell, we talked about the bit of creation, basically the first part of the what most people know as the Voluspa, focusing specifically on creation. We touched on everything from the fires of Muspelheim and the ice of Niflheim coming together in Gununga Gap to birth Ymir and Adhumbla. Adhumbla licking the ice and Bury being in there. What else did we touch on? We touched on, it's going to take me a few more times to hear the name, but there not being 9 realms in the sense of how people usually understand it, but 3 realms and 9 homes. The base being Jormungand, the third being Midgard, and the highest being Asgard, and then there being other homes on those levels. And then we alluded to coming in today, talking about the Golden Age and Golveg Hive coming in. I'm missing something. I'm missing something important.
Well, there's a lot we talked about for sure. So I mean, in 2-minute review of it, you've done really well so far.
Yeah.
But this is one thing I want people to understand about as we're going through this lore. This isn't going to be just like 1 or 2 episodes. This is going to be a long procession that we're going to go through, going over all the details of it. And that's really important because it's going to give everybody a firm understanding of how everything evolved. I do want to revisit some things that we talked about last week. I'm sure you probably have a couple things you want to touch on as well. Do you want to start with anything you might want to kind of review or go over or add information to?
I guess for me, just quickly recapping the 3 worlds and the 9 homes and how that looks. Because like I said, I remember the base being Jormungand, and Helheim is there. That's also where they do the hell thing. And then the mid-level is so that's like Midgard, but Earth is also Midgard, or is there a different name for our level?
Our station, okay, so there's Jormungand, which always exists, is not destroyed. It's the fertile soil of creation, and it's where all creation returns when it dies. The second creation was Midgard. So you know about how he took his spine and made mountains, and blood were oceans, and his hairs were trees and things like this. You know, this is a description of creation processes happening. And they created Midgard. And then after they created Midgard and they capped it with his skull to make the heavens firmament, essentially, they then created Asgard, the third world, the home of the gods. So Earth is not Midgard. Earth is Mannheim, the home of the men. Yeah, then they began building Asgard. And when they erect Asgard, they created it at the top of Yggdrasil. But they still allowed Yggdrasil to pierce through. And actually talking about the 9 worlds is something I want to go a little bit more in depth on, and the reason behind this. So, and the reason why it's important to understand, because this gets us to the core of how misinformation is spread among our folk. So Snorri Sturluson, and there was other writers that had written about the 9 worlds, and each writer had actually given the worlds some slightly different names in each work. So there was confusion during the Christian era exactly what these 9 worlds represented, or homes, what they were. And Snorri Sturluson had written out his ideas. You can see that he's struggling with the names because he can't, in his writings, he can't decide on the name for Muspelheim. And it's one of those things that kind of makes it obvious that this is kind of where it started at with the 9 worlds, is because he had a Christian worldview of things, and they had different layers of the heavens, essentially 7. And we see this exact same thing happening with like the Anglo-Saxon literature that survived, that was written during the Christian age, where they equate, instead of 9 worlds, they put 7 worlds because they're trying to equate it to the Christian heavens. So that misunderstanding had proliferated for a long time, many centuries. And then when we get into the 20th century, we see occult forces that are utilizing these concepts of like 9 worlds or 7 worlds in esoteric ways from traditions that don't come from our folk or the traditions that we descend from. And they were introduced mainly in the 80s by a person with the pseudonym of Edred Thorson. He had written his book Futhark, and then the nine doors of Yggdrasil. And he essentially, his work, Futhark, was actually based on the Black Runa, which is a work that he had written under the Temple of Set. So the Temple of Set is an occult organization, and they proliferate satanic or Satanism as a religion. Edward Thorson, aka Stephen Flowers, is also the person that founded the Rune Guild. He was a protege of a CIA operative that was in charge of psychological warfare. With the Black Runa, he had just copied it almost word for word and made his book Futhark. So he's introducing ideas. He took symbology from the Germanic and Norse traditions and injected this satanic occult philosophy in there. And then people began buying these books back in the 80s and 90s, and there wasn't a whole lot of information that existed at that time that people could rely on for Germanic paganism, at least not authentic stuff. Manuscripts, the internet didn't exist. So folk got these books and they just consumed it. They would read it and they'd get to know it, and they believed that this is what the religion consisted of. And they built traditions of these things. And that's kind of where we find ourselves in a state today, where we have people that now have access to a lot more information, a lot more of the lore, the folklore, the laws, and other writings of other European historians and mythologists. And we understand it much better today than people did in the 70s and 80s. And so there's this clash of ideas that's happening right now. And the clash of the ideas is essentially people that recognize today from what we have, that there is a tradition, there is a system, and it is based on how our ancestors actually practiced this religion, and not something that was just made up by outside forces and influencers that changed the way people perceived what our religion actually is today.
So I'm just going to ask the obvious question, just in case there are people that haven't heard this before. So a lot of new people, they always hear that, oh, all of our lore was heavily influenced by Christian monks and altered by various Christians, this, that, and the other thing. So what is there that we know is absolutely heathen in origin, and how do we know that?
Great question. And that is a question that people always try to bring up. And I think this gets to the root of how people understand our gods and goddesses too. You and I were just talking the other day about how I was listening to a podcast, and the person has kind of a big following, but he was talking about Odin, for example. And he was trying to propagate the idea that Odin, Wotan, Odin with the double DH, and Wodan aren't the same gods, that these were different gods of different tribes and such. The problem with that's exactly what happened during the Christian conversion period, where they tried to confuse people and divide the folk as a whole, the tribe as a whole. I mean, these are stories that children grew up listening to around fires for lifetime and generation after generation that were retold. Our folk had a general understanding of the mythology. And one of the things that we see, for example, in the Poetic Edda, and we've talked about this before, how the meter of the poetry can accurately be dated to 8th century Old Norse. Therefore, we know for a fact by that meter of that poetry that those are original heathen stories. Now, a lot of the poetry that we see in the Poetic Edda speaks in a matter-of-fact type of way. And what I mean by that is it assumes that the audience that's hearing the poem or the story knows more of the story that's not being told. So this gives us enough evidence and enough, I guess you would say, faith that what we have is a bigger story that existed and was connected between the different tribes. Now, where people get this wrong, and the thing about the Odin and the Odin and the Wotan and how, this person was trying to explain how they're all different, that really gets me is, number one, that perspective doesn't actually have a sound basis in how linguistics works in the evolutions of tongues and sound shifts between tribes. It would be like saying, well, Jamaican English is different than the King's English, which is different than the 30 dialects of American English. Like he was trying to say a single letter in a word makes it different, like the word it and is. One letter changes what the word means. And while there is some truth in that, that's not how language works. I mean, we have places in America where some people say tomato, some people say tomato, And some of these arguments that I hear are really ridiculous. And I think we have to combat these ideas, because you can never unite a people if you try to make them believe that each tribe had different gods and each tribe's gods were solely theirs and none other, because that's not the truth. If that's what you're trying to project, then we would be the only folk in the entire world that had no spiritual religion that was uniform. We'd be the only ones just wandering around aimlessly with no purpose or divine guidance. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I think one area where as a movement that we struggle is the people that are not getting it right. They speak very confidently. They have a high amount of charisma, and they present it as this is what it is. To where, like, even myself, I'm guilty of the slight opposite approach, where as much as I don't like the word humble, I don't like to come across like I know everything. So I say things like, this is what I've learned, or this is what I believe, instead of this is what it is. And I think across the board, as we move forward on putting out our own information and taking control of the narrative back from outsiders, we need to have a more forceful presentation of our message. Not like negative, not like you believe this or else, but we have to, as a movement, be more confident in saying that this is what it is. Does that make sense?
Exactly. Reclaiming our heritage is what it comes down to. And all of this ties to the lore. And we'll get to parts of this, but I will mention in advance before we actually get to this part, this all ties back from the very beginning of the creation of man and Govek Hyde. So we know the story of Rig coming and teaching the runes and the laws and culture. When that happened, when Rig came, that happened because Govek Hyde and her brood were going door to door spreading misinformation. And this is one of the reasons why the gods ended up killing her. So those things were started a very long time ago. And it's still part of our duty to protect our tradition from that. And this is going to go to, and this is actually a really good jumping point back into our conversation last week, because understanding how everything was created and the powers and the authorities were divided gives us purpose as a people of what we're here for. So jumping into that let me mention that when the gods were at their thing setting and Odin was giving different authorities to different folk and they had created Mythgard, before all of this transpires, Honor mates with Nat, the mother of nights, and produces Jord, Frigga, right? Mm-hmm. And then Lothar also mates with Nat and produces Njord, Mani, and Sol. Now, Nat, the mother of nights, is the child of Besla and Mimir. Now, if everybody's paying attention, Besla is also Odin's mother as well, by Bur. So Besla also mated with Mimir and produced children of her own. Honor is the chief or progenitor of the Vanir. And Lothar, we had kind of alluded to this last week in our episode about how I believed he helped form some of the dark elves and that they created maggots and stuff out of the rotting flesh of Mimir's feet. And from these, they created like likenesses of men. And so what's interesting, if we consider the theory that I've kind of dropped a couple hints to, is that we know that Besla and Mimir mated and made not. How is it not also possible that Mimir and Besla mated and produced Lothar, which fits perfectly with the lore, because I believe he's the one that created the dark elves, and we know it's a child of Mimir's that created the dark elves. And then he is then a half brother of Besla. Then he's a half brother of Odin via Besla, which would make a lot of sense of how Mimir gave Odin the drink of wisdom from the well, and that Lothar became jealous of that because he had sworn an oath with Odin to always drink from the same horn, or at least that's the oath that is the Lord tells us that was made with Loki. So this goes with the idea of Lothar and Loki possibly being the same entity, right? None of that's clear in the lore. So I just want everybody to know none of that's clear in the lore. That's theories that I have. It does make sense in my mind, and I thought it was worth mentioning. But so from Not and Lothar, Nord is born, Mani is born, and Sol is born. From Honor, Jord, Frigga, Mother Earth, is born. And then she also mated with Dellinger, who comes from the gods as well. And they created Dagr, which created the line of the light elves, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Dellinger is also most likely one of the descendants of Mimir, but they created the light elves. So what's interesting is all of this ties into some of our rituals as well, because everybody knows about Yule. Some people know of a tradition about, the Mother Night of Yule, the tradition, and they think it has to do with the Disir, but it actually has to do with not the goddess, not herself. She is the mother of night, and then the days of darkness happen after that.
So it sounds like from what you're saying, night birthed a lot of things.
Yes, night definitely produced a lot of things. And so all of these things were actually happening in Jormungand. And after the tribes were formed, they had the thing steady, and Ymir was killed, as we mentioned last week. And then a peace compact was made. And this is after, or kind of during the same period when Midgard and Asgard was created. And when that peace compact was signed, they also exchanged hostages from each of the tribes. So some of the Vanir went to the Aesir, and some of the Aesir went to the Vanir. Honir was among the Aesir. He went to the Vanir, since he was also the progenitor. And then this is where Golve kind of enters the story, where she's given from the Thursar. And the lore alludes to also possibly Loki. Not exactly sure on origins altogether, but comes to the Aesir as well. And Golve Hyde is the same person in the lore. Angerbulda she's also called Aurbulda, and she becomes a handmaiden of Frigga. Now, during this entire process, at the Thing City, Odin delegates different stations and positions to all of the gods that are created. Sol, Mani, all of them, all of the children, and they're given different stations. During the same process, Odin gives authority to the Vanir for the consistencies within the laws of time in the course of the worlds in Midgard. and power over some of the vegetative and regenerating things in the in the Midgard. So the Aesir, their purpose was to defend the creation, against things that would try to destroy it, like Ymir destroying the nourishment from Athumla. So this is why Asgard was also created. Does all of that make sense?
Yeah. One thing that I did want to touch on about your your theory of Lodor and Loki being the same person, to me that makes a lot more sense for the connection between Odin and Loki than what I originally heard, which was that they did a blood brother bond. And to me, it makes more sense for them to already be family because Odin sacrificed his eye, hung from the tree, talked to the Volva from the Voluspa. So he knew everything that Loki would do, and it said that Frigg knows everything and sees nothing. So why would they let some random Jotun come in that they know is going to be the destruction of them all? That makes no sense. But if he's already involved, if he's already there, it makes a little bit more sense of why they would give him so many chances.
Exactly. And it also makes sense if they're all exchanging hostages with each other. We don't see exactly where the Elven or the Alfar hostages come in from. And so it would make sense that at the same time, if Lothar is actually from the Elfar line from Mimir, that he would go to the Aesir, because they would also need to exchange hostages. Now, the Vanir and the Alfar did swear allegiances to the Aesir. The Thursar did, and they just signed the peace treaty or agreed to the peace treaty. And that kind of ushers in the new age of the golden age. And it's during that golden age when the hostages were exchanged and there was a time of peace, and nobody really understood, nobody knew exactly what Golveg was doing in the midst. She was causing all sorts of problems and casting spells on people or gods and goddesses and causing havoc among things. So it's during this time when she's essentially infiltrating the gods' circles, and they don't realize exactly what she is at this time and what she's doing, and she's able to cause a whole bunch of havoc. But while this is going on, Lothar, the gods, the elves, the dark elves, they're all able, in the Vanir, they're all able to travel in Midgard. So they make homes in different places. They're able to come to, Earth as we know it today, as well, Mannheim. But it's during this time that Odin, Honor, and Lothar create the first man. Now, can you recap that story of the creation of the first man?
Odin, Hodor, and Lodor came to Mannheim, Midgard, and they were walking along the beach, and they found two pieces of driftwood, an ash tree and an elm tree, respectively. Hence, the first man and woman being named Ask and Embla. And Odin gave them spirit. Hodor gave them, I think, life in goodly hue, and Lodor gave them. I'm drawing a blank.
It's okay.
I haven't read that bit in forever.
It's okay. I got you here. So, Lothar is actually the one that gives them the ability to have a godly complexion. He gives them shape and form, and he also gives them the ability to make sounds and hear, right?
Okay.
And then Honor gives them the ability to understand and have insight into things, intelligence, comprehension. He gives them odor. So Lother gives La and Laity and Liter Gotha. So La and Laity is the ability to make sounds, and the Laity is the ability to hear. And Liter Gotha is the godly complexion or the blood, the life force, right?
Okay.
Which is interesting because when we go back to the maggots that formed off of Ymir's rotting feet, that if Lother is Durin, which I've suggested a few times now, that he already had practice and skill in creating the shapes of men-like things. So Honor gives Other, which is the insight, the comprehension, consciousness of the life form. And then Odin gives them Ond, or the force or breath or soul of life. He animates those other gifts. And that's what created the broad folk as a whole. Now, during this time of peace, when men were created, Odin had given them Malrunor. He taught them Malrunor, speech runes. And this is how men were able to know how to understand each other and speak words of understanding to one another as well. Odin gave that gift.
I was just going to say, so it could kind of be looked at the gift of body, mind, and spirit on a basic understanding.
On a very basic understanding, yes. So he also at the same time gave them basic laws to live by as well. So men go on, they create and procreate and have children, Ask and Embla. But I want to touch on a couple things, and this kind of will bring us back to our last episode when we were talking about Yggdrasil, us being created from the Ask and the Elm tree, Ask and Embla, in Yggdrasil. So there is an interesting connection to Yggdrasil and Idun that I think needs to be touched on. Now, people aren't 100% sure what Yggdrasil actually is, whether it's the ash tree. Some have suggested the oak tree has been referred to it. And people have also made a connection to the apple tree. And this goes back to the golden seed that Yggdrasil actually grew from at the beginning of time. Because we know that when the gods reside in Asgard, Yggdrasil goes through the roof. It goes all the way through it. And from there, fruits develop. And these are the fruits or that Idun gives to the gods so that they can continue to live and not ever age. So there is an ancient Vedic tradition about what's called the golden seed of creation. And that story, that golden seed, and Rydberg made the same connection as well. That golden seed comes from those apple trees. It makes sense in my mind when you're looking at the story how Idun, she gathers the apples from the tree, the sacred tree, and when she hands them to the gods, they eat of it and they're able to survive. And that tree is like a sacred force or energy of life itself, the ability to produce things. And it also leaves seeds in its core, in its pits, for the next trees to grow. So I always found that interesting.
The apple tree is the first time that I've heard that, but that actually makes a lot of sense. Because we always hear about Idun's apples, but never where she gets them. But if Yggdrasil was indeed a form of an apple tree, and that's the apples are coming from the tree that's holding everything together itself, that actually makes a lot of sense.
Right. And so, but people obviously will say, well, hey, the lore says ash tree, the great mighty ash tree. So what we have to remember about these things is that most of the time in the lore, when it's saying certain things, it's said in a kenning. It's not necessarily using the word for it, but it's using a descriptive way to make a suggestion of it.
Yeah, because like the other one that I read once was Yggdrasil being a yew tree because our ancestor, and I forget the specifics. Maybe you might know enough to elaborate on it, but the yew tree was looked at as like a tree of both life and death. Something about if people sat under a yew tree on a hot day, there were like fumes, or if they ate from it, like the tree was poisonous in a way, but it also helped to create things uh that saved lives. So I always thought that was an interesting theory too, of Yggdrasil being a yew tree, and just the concepts of life and death around that tree.
Yeah, no, so yes, I've heard the exact same thing. You're spot on with that theory of it. And I think that Yggdrasil is all of those. And this is something that's really important for people to understand as well, is that the word, like in our religion, we say asa, true or faithful to the asa, to the Aesir.
Mm-hmm.
That word true, it comes from the word tree. The word faith or religion or being true comes from the word tree, trau, troth. That is, so when we refer to our religion as like the tree religion, that's because that's what actually our faith is. It is the faith of the tree of life. And you see today, like writers that are exploring like Celtic mythology and stuff, and they have with the Celtic mythology connected like druids, people wise in the true of the tree.
Mm-hmm.
They have connected that with a tree religion, but a lot of people today haven't made that same connection with our faith, even though it is the same. It is exactly the same. Our faith is the trout. It's the tree. And there are secret knowledge that was taught among the, I guess you would call them priests in our language today, the priest class, that they would pass on knowledge about different trees. And there were teachings that went along with each tree and what they represented. The whole story in the creation myth, you probably will recall about how there was Ratatoskr, and he would run up and down the tree, and he would bring words to the great eagle at the top. And from what he heard from Nithog, that gnaws at the roots of the tree. That story is very important because it actually relates to more things that were more practical in the day-to-day life, and teaching like children and other folk how to actually live life, because you see the process of what like squirrels do. They take the nuts, they bury them, they have the foresight to know that they're going to need them throughout the winter to survive, and that some of those trees are going to spring forth life again.
Mm-hmm.
So these are things that are hidden in our myth that a lot of people don't automatically see when they're reading it, but it's there. And that's exactly what our faith is. It is the tree faith. It's the trau.
Yeah, and when I think about the importance of the tree in our religion in general, I also think of the term I forget the like house tree, like the law, like I think it's like the law of the house. You know, what happens in the house stays in the house type deal. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Have you heard? Okay. So it's once you start reading, you see the importance of the underlying importance of trees in general.
The tree is definitely the core essence of what our faith is, because it is the energy of life itself. That's what it represents. So I thought that was a really important thing to make sure I brought up from last week's episode that we didn't really touch on, was that tree. And I also want to talk about a little bit how like souls go into man, into other things as well, because we left the last episode talking about how, the three different wells, the past, present, and future, and how the souls come out of the well, Brunner. It comes out of her well, and she has control over what soul is chosen to go back into creation in Midgard. But Honer, being the father of the Vanir Disir, the Vana Disir, were given the task of delivering the souls to Earth, to Midgard. And we hear in the mythology about swans and such. And this is, even though they deliver them, Holner has authority of who the soul goes to in the mother. Frigga can also decide too. She can shape the course of things and choose mothers as well. But Holner has the absolute authority to that. That was one of his authorities given by Odin.
I never heard that before. That's interesting. I had heard of the Disir bringing the spirits, but I did not know that there was somebody involved with specifically dictating where they go.
So this has to do with your fate and the way things weave as well, because obviously Earth being fate's judgment, at Earth's judgment during the hell thing, she is the decider of what soul gets to go back into creation. And then those are delivered by the Disir to the mothers that were chosen for that soul. And this is important. And as we continue to go through the myth, we'll get a little deeper and deeper each time into the folk soul and how it originates and how it relates to us and why it's important. I hope people are kind of starting to see the bigger picture, though, by this point. It goes back to the authorities that were given to each tribe by Odin and who they come from. Because the Vanir were given authorities over nature and time and the movement of time and the movement of planets and such. The Aesir were given the task of defending creation against things that would destroy it, like Ymir destroying the source of nourishment for the gods, Aduma.
It makes sense in that there would be a balance of continuing the lines and then defending what's there. Like it would be counterproductive isn't the right word, but just the fact that there's not just going back to the concept of there's no singularity, everything spreads out. It makes sense that there's going to be different powers involved with different functions of life.
Exactly. And I mean, we can look a little bit to different parts of the lore too. And even though Earth chooses the soul, we have to remember that there are gods that can intervene in different things. Like in our first episode, we talked about the Vinili and who became the Longobards and how Frigga intervened with Odin to make them victorious. The gods can do the same thing throughout creation. And this is why petitioning to the gods is fruitful, for specific reasons in building relationships between yourself, your family, and your tribe or clan with those gods that specifically help you. They can do the same. Like we know that during battle, those slain half go to Freya and Volkvanger, and the other half go to Odin and get to feast at Valhalla. So this all relates to how those gods can intervene and grab souls and bring them to certain stations as well.
Yeah, and just touching on that bit, it always struck me as curious that though Odin is the All-Father, he gives Freya the first choice of the slain.
Actually, nowhere does it say the first choice of the slain. She just it just says that she receives half of the slain.
I don't know where I'd pick it. I mean, that's a common thing that a lot of people say, so that's where I picked it up.
Exactly. No, we all heard that. That's a very common thing that people say, and it's just another example of one of those things that are injected into our history that just is not true. She may get the first half, but there's nothing that actually says that. It just says that she gets half of it and Odin gets half. It doesn't say who actually chooses the first half.
For all we know, they could be playing rock, paper, scissors every time.
Well, they do like games, Tafel.
Yeah. So. Sorry, I just got that image in my head of Odin and Freya over the battlefield playing rock, paper, scissors.
That's funny. All right, who's gonna win this time, Freya?
Yeah. Yeah.
Best 3 out of 5.
Yeah. No, I said best 5 out of 7.
That's funny.
Oh man.
Man, I think we got out again tonight.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely feel like as we get in the swing of these, they're definitely getting a lot smoother. Um, I definitely feel like I'm able to like start contributing a little more, which is, kind of nice for me. And I think to a certain degree, like the more I think about it, I underestimate the value of more or less having the basics down because, like in my position with the kindred in the organization that I'm with, um, I've started to notice that there's a lot of people that don't, so it kind of it makes it harder for me to second guess myself when like I'm not trying to say that I'm better than anyone or nothing like that, but I do have the basics down and there's a lot of people that
Dope.
just don't and they need somebody that does to help them learn it and I'd like to think that I'm able to talk about these things in the simplest level so that anybody that wants to understand can. But I can't
Yep.
have a conversation with you without having my mind blown. So sometimes that doesn't help.
It's okay. It's okay. I mean, we all start somewhere.
Yeah.
I'm not a young spring chicken anymore. I've experienced a lot. I've read a lot. I've had some great teachers throughout my life that have taught me a lot, and I appreciate every single one of them. And everybody, at some point when they're on the path of searching and seeking for knowledge, they'll find different teachers throughout the way, and you'll get something from every single one of them.
Yeah.
One of in my life, actually, one of my greatest, I wouldn't say like mentor per se. Man, this guy was so wise. Like he had a really good take on life in general, like living in it and relationships with people. And he really helped me transform, some of my thinking about, the way I viewed the world at the time. Because I was just a young kid, I didn't know much, and he really gave me insight into like stopping, examining myself, figuring out who I was, and set me on a path of studying different things, history and religions, and this and that. And I spent many, many years in my 20s studying every religion in the world, looking for the path. And all of that is things that start opening your eyes in your younger years as you start studying and digging and diving deeper. And when you start doing that, that's when that spiritual connection itself will reignite in you. And that's how I found the faith of my forefathers, of my ancestors of old, is that spark was lit in me. And then I began having, spiritual experiences. And I didn't always understand or wasn't able to relate them to things specifically. But as I started diving more and more into my ancestral traditions and lore and mythologies, the more I actually began to understand what I was experiencing in those spiritual experiences.
I definitely think on a personal level, like I'm 31, but I'm in a lot of ways, I'm still very early on. So, like from my perspective, it's like an onion. I peel something back, I start getting an understanding, and then there's more there. Except for the onion's not getting smaller; it's getting bigger with every layer that I pull off.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I definitely know what you mean. Um, Kind of getting back to the gods and that, I did also want to talk a little bit about the creation of Asgard. We had mentioned how they had put the skull as a barrier between the firmaments. And when they created Asgard, there was a few halls that were initially created. Bilskirnir, Valhalla was built, Gladsheimer was built, and Gladheimer is where the Valaskjalf is situated, and it's in the center of Asgard, and that was Odin's first home there, and it's where his throne, Hildskjalf, where he sits upon, and he's able to see and pierce through all of creation and see everything that happens. And then, you probably know how they built a wall around Asgard from Ymir's bone. I think it's called Leirbrimr, and that wall is foretold to last until the end of days, when Asgard is destroyed by Surt's sword. So what I find interesting about these different names is, we know like the word Val represents the slain, and Hild is like battle or fight, and Skald is like fertility or something that generates something, right? So I find it really interesting that his throne is called Hildskjalf, because that essentially means the battle progenitor or fertility. That from that seat is where he's able to view the conflicts of creation.
Yeah, no, I mean it's definitely an interesting thought, especially like as I've learned more about Odin, his battle or war connections were secondary to his being a god of wisdom and magic. And one thing that I've always kind of wondered is, okay, so the fallen warriors go to Valhalla, and I'm wondering, and it doesn't say it anywhere, but it's just a thought, if maybe there are not thinkers, philosophers, various bits of knowledge and education that people who have achieved a certain level, would they go and sit with Odin in his main hall?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question.
So I mean, I can't say yes or no. I wouldn't think so, but it is interesting, just with him having Valhalla, but his battle functions kind of, for lack of a better term, being secondary. Odin always searching for wisdom. I would wonder if he would also bring other knowledgeable people around him.
I don't know the answer to that question outright, but my thoughts on it are this: probably not. And the reason why is because I believe he takes that spirit or that soul to the energy of that warrior that died in battle to Valhalla in preparation, as they, practice every day and die and fight and feast again at night, and for Ragnarok. That he needs that energy for that great battle at the end of time. And I think other people that are wise and stuff, they stay in the Kinwell. And this is in the importance, and it kind of goes back to Erd, choosing the soul that goes, and Honor choosing the mother, is that in our birthing process, when we name one of our children, in the ritual and the sprinkling of the water representing, obviously the waters of the three wells, because you sprinkle the child 3 times, and the naming and call the ancestor or the person or the soul that you want to the body. So that Erd grabs that soul, gives it to the Disir as a fruit from the tree of life, and they deliver it to the mother. So, last night after you left from the bloat, we had a really good conversation with husband and wife that were here about a dream that she had about a bear chasing her in her dreams, and that it kept trying to get her. And what I found really interesting about her dreams is that the bear is associated with birth. And she was having these dreams, prior to actually becoming pregnant. She became pregnant shortly afterwards. I think that, that the gods, and I think this is evidence, and obviously there's nothing on a scientific measurable scale where you can say this is absolutely how it is. To understand the processes of life, I think we're very right on when we say, that the soul is traveling to the mother. And we see these things, and anybody could see the patterns of the universe and how it works. But some people are more adept to seeing those patterns than other people. And it does take training to understand them. And that's why we had traditions where, quote unquote, priests would teach the next generation of people this information to pass on and to secure and protect. And it goes back to the tradition of like the sacred mead and who possesses it, who can drink out of it, because it was guarded information. Because when you understand how things work, you can actually change the course of things or the course of events through means of intervention of different gods and goddesses. You can change the course of events through means of what people call today as magic. And I'm not talking about little rocks in your pocket and it's all, carrying it around town. I'm talking about real, tuned in, connected to the universe, shamanistic-like abilities to affect things. And I think that's very important for people to understand that concept within our own faith as well.
Yeah, because the bit of magic that I have studied, one of the main things that they always talk about is the focus of your intent. And science has attributed this to the law of attraction, the law of manifestation, whatever you want to call it. But at a super basic level, all magic is, as we understand it, is just a focusing of the will and using tools to help that will interact in such a way that the higher powers will intervene on your behalf.
After the creation of man, and Odin gave them, the Mal or the ability to speak and understand, and he gave them a basic set of laws to live by. There really wasn't much intervention on the behalf of the gods with the folk, because everything was a time of peace. Even the folk live in peace, and the gods did take notice of them during that period. But we are definitely going to get into the topic and conversation of magic. And it's a very deep conversation. We don't have enough time today to get into it, but our tradition certainly recognizes different forms of magic. It never has anything to do with intents. And a lot of people today, there's a lot of different books that are written by all these quote unquote gurus that have all different ways of practicing magic. And yes, there can be power that's built behind those traditions that are relatively new in the new age, but they're not authentic. They don't come from our people, and it misunderstands how our people understood magic. One of the laws that the gods have given to us is that we should never interfere with the natural creation process and the natural inclinations of things. Like, we shouldn't pervert nature. That's essentially what people call quote unquote black magic is. It's when you're perverting what the natural intent of something is, making it do something that it's not meant or its fate is not supposed to be.
As our folkish understanding, or the understanding of our folk, like I have some knowledge, that spans across different traditions or ways, but my understanding of how it applies to our folk is extremely limited.
I understand. I mean, that's a natural state of the folk as a whole today. Is everybody has this very superficial understanding what the faith is, and there's like no meat and potatoes to it for, I would say, 99% of the people out there practicing. There are people out there that do have a really deep connection to this faith and do understand it on a much deeper level. And us and what we're doing, I think, is important to changing the narrative, like we talked about at the very beginning of this episode. And that the reasons why we have to do this, because this is the food, the whole idea of, everybody worships something different and we don't have the same gods, even though we all come from the same people. That's ludicrous, and that just divides us. We have to understand this faith in its totality, our connection to the souls of our folk in the Kinwell, in Yggdrasil, and the connection to Odin, being our progenitor in creating us, in teaching us runes initially, the laws that he had given to us. And when we begin to understand that connection, then we're actually living the tradition of our folk. Then we understand it. Until then, we're just lost in identitarian politics. And that's never going to go anywhere, because there's no substance there that touches people's souls. It's a very superficial thing.
Yeah, and it kind of irks me how many, and again, I'm not trying to badmouth anyone at all, but how many people are just okay with that superficial level of understanding. And that's why, I definitely appreciate, the people that take their time to listen to this, because we are really trying to give people food for thought, and help them deepen their understanding as we also deepen ours. I kind of look at this as as a journey for everybody involved.
That in perspective, we can understand where the state of our folk is today.
And two, it also opens up a lot more interesting questions to other life that might be out there. So this has been The Sacred Stew. I am Anthony. My co-host is James. And hope you all have a good night.